Other paragraphs of the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, are really important and for anybody who is thinking of objecting. And I was just going to take you to one particular paragraph, which I think is where you'll find the kind of the essence of the kind of points that you'd want to argue if you're objecting to such development. And they're to be found in paragraph 205 of the NPPF. I'll just, if you don't mind, read some of it. It says this: when determining planning applications, great weight should be given to the benefits of mineral extraction. So this is a point I read earlier on, including to the economy. In considering proposals for mineral extraction, mineral planning authorities should, as far as practicable, provide for the maintenance of land banks of non-energy minerals from outside national parks, the Broads, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and World Heritage Sites, scheduled monuments and conservation areas. So it's about that. What that paragraph, subparagraph, is effectively saying is don't look for non-energy minerals, which we're not particularly concerned with, in national parks and Broads and other areas which are protected. On a more generic basis, it's saying also that mineral planning authorities should ensure that there are no unacceptable adverse impacts on the natural and historic environment, human health or aviation safety, and take into account the cumulative effect of multiple impacts from individual sites and or from a number of sites in the locality. So there it's saying that the decision makers have really got to think very carefully about the question of whether adverse impacts on those points of importance, natural and historic environment, human health, are unacceptable. It's not saying there won't be some impacts, but it's about the question of whether or not they're acceptable. And that's a general kind of way that planning decision makers approach adverse impacts. But if we don't know, this comes back to my precautionary principle point. If we don't know, in fact, whether or not, well, firstly, whether or not the regulatory system is as robust as the government thinks it is. I think they call it a gold standard regulatory system, which is bizarre.
Laughable.
Yeah, laughable, yeah. But that's the first thing. We've got a regulatory system which perhaps isn't properly funded or properly resourced. If you've got that regulatory system, and then you've got, untested in this country anyway, and not properly kind of assessed, other than a few years ago in a very kind of haphazard way, I think, methods of production like acidization, fracturing, hydraulic fracturing, and the like. Then, and you're then allowing that kind of development to take place close to residential communities, aquifers, and all sorts. Then you're really dicing with danger. And the precautionary principle, as I said, really, and it's a principle that comes from EU law, really does make it quite clear that in those circumstances, and if I just read from the case where it was laid down, a case called Afton Chemicals, it lays down this point that it justifies restrictive measures where it's impossible to determine with certainty the existence or extent of a risk due to the insufficiency of scientific research, where the likelihood of harm to the public health persists. And although it was rejected in the Frackman case as an argument on the evidence in that case, I think that in every case which you may come across, you'll be able to rely on and argue that the precautionary principle ought to tell in favour of an application being rejected. Because if we don't know what the real risks are, then who's to say whether they're acceptable or not? Then there's a more obvious point, or perhaps a more classic planning point in this paragraph. It says that mineral planning authorities should ensure that any unavoidable noise, dust and particle emissions Any blasting vibrations are controlled, mitigated or removed at source, and establish appropriate noise limits for extraction in proximity to noise-sensitive properties. And it may be that individuals, as opposed to a community, will be more affected, the closer they are to a particular site. But noise, dust, particle emissions are extremely important. I saw something in the paper today. There's been a report out about the impacts of air quality on human health. Apparently, air pollution affects every organ in our bodies. I mean, I suppose we probably all knew that, but nobody's really had it spelt out, and it's becoming much more, quite rightly, in vogue that we argue about air quality in respect of any development, let alone the kind of development that we're talking about here. Now, there's also a paragraph which requires the mineral planning authorities to provide for restoration and aftercare at the earliest opportunity. And that just brings me to, and talks about bonds or other financial guarantees to underpin planning conditions. And it just brings to mind the thought, and I don't really, there are people amongst the kind of community networks I know who've done a lot of research on this point. But these companies, like Quadrilla, who's to say they're just going to disappear and then leave those sites, without having complied with the restoration condition? It all depends on how long their backers will support them as they see the public's antipathy towards these types of operations, and when they pull the plug, it seems to me. And what insurance is there also taken out? For example, for those who are suffering from any damage caused, I'm looking at Newdigate, I think over there, by the Newdigate swarm earthquakes. What if we have a slightly bigger earthquake, God forbid, and somebody's house falls down, or there's somebody injured, or I don't know whether or not providing there's a causal link, and I think we probably all think there must be, but providing that evidence can be shown, who's going to end up paying for that? Who's going to end up compensating the individuals concerned? And it may not just be one or two individuals, it may be a large community. So that's obviously a point. I think I saw an email from somebody who had argued that perhaps the county council might be negligent for granting permission where such seismic events might occur. I think it may be that it's not the county council that would be negligent, but it might be the Oil and Gas Authority or the Environment Agency or those that are responsible for the regulation who might come under closer scrutiny. Because again, local authorities, as I've said, are required as a matter of government policy to take the position that the regulatory body is going to be effective. So they're told by the government, you don't have to worry about regulation. And indeed, up in Lancashire, the inspector made it quite clear. I'm advised by the NPPF that I shouldn't look more closely at the question of whether or not the regulatory body is up to scratch.